6 outs equal about 24%, and so on. Specific draws in Hold'em in Omaha. Flush draw with 2 overcards or a straight flush draw, 15 outs. Flush draw with 1 overcard, 12 outs. Flush draw, 9 outs. Open-ended straight draw, 8 outs. 2 overcards, 6 outs. Gut shot straight draw, 4 outs. How to compute poker equity. Count your outs. In order to determine your equity, your chances of winning the pot, you require to first understand the number of outs you need to make your hand. This ends up being easy and fast with a little memorization and a little practice. Keep in mind, there are 4 cards of every suit and 13 of every match. If you have an open-ended straight draw, there are 2 various worths of cards that will offer you your hand. 2 times 4 equals 8 outs. If you have a flush draw, there are 13 cards of that fit. You hold 2 of them, and 2 of them are on the board. 13 minus 2 equals 9 outs. When counting your outs, you require to keep in mind the concept of anti-outs, and potentially even blockers. If by making your straight, you likewise finish the flush of your challenger, then those straight cards are not outs to your hand and can't be counted. The possibility of a flush makes use of the board and can turn a successful 8-out straight draw into a 6-out straight draw, rendering your chances inadequate. If you can't make an astute reduction of the worth of your challenger's hand, err on the side of caution and constantly presume that they have a hand dangerous to your own. If there's a flush draw, presume they have the draw. If the board is paired, presume they have the set. It's less costly to mistakenly fold a hand than to lose your entire stack. The easy equity faster way. Equity faster way is vital in live action. The simplest method to get your equity is to bear in mind these 2 easy guidelines. On the flop, increase your outs by 4. On the turn, increase your outs by 2. This suggests with an open-ended straight draw, 8 outs, you have a 32% possibility of making your straight with 2 cards to come. For hands on the flop, with a lot of outs, more than 8, the previous faster way provides a somewhat inaccurate response. There's an easy formula you can keep in mind to get a somewhat more precise figure. Variety of outs multiplied by 4 minus variety of outs subtracted by 8 equals equity. This suggests the equity of an open-ended straight flush draw 15 outs would be 15 multiplied by 4 minus 15 minus 8 equals 53%. Without this little formula, the portion would be greater by 7 points, offering us a synthetically big outcome. If your equity estimations are incorrect, you can't make informed choices. Putting pot chances and equity together. As you can see, equity and pot chances hold a lot of reasonably easy estimations. All that they need is some memorization of the strategies and solutions and a bit of practice computing them in your head. If they invest a little quantity of time practicing, for some individuals, this will be much simpler than for others. However, everybody can do it. Keep in mind that suggested chances alter the game of No Limit Hold'em significantly. Having a really large quantity of suggested chances can render a call proper even, though pot chances would render it definitely inaccurate. Equity. The rule of 2 and 4. Expect you get to the turn, holding the nut flush draw. Ace 5 on a King 4 7 queen board. Your heads up versus a nitty bad guy who never ever puts cash in the pot without a strong hand. He wagered the flop and has actually now pushed all in on the turn. That makes the pot $80 and it will cost you $30 to call. Should you fold or call? We're positive, provided our continued reading, bad guy, that he's not bluffing. He has at least 2 pairs and we require to strike our flush in order to win the hand. Let's think of the chances on a deal. Without any future wagering possible, calling would run the risk of $30 to an $80. So we're getting chances of 80 to 30 or 8 to 3. The number of cards makes our hands. There are 46 hidden cards. Of those, any of the 9 remaining hearts will make our flush. However, the queen or the 7 would combine the board and extremely perhaps provide bad guy a set or quads. So we choose not to count those among our outs. That leaves 7 cards that would offer us the winning hand, and 39 that will not. The chances versus us winning the hand are approximated as 39 to 7, or 5.57 to 1. The pot chances we're being provided are 8 to 3, or 2.67 to 1. To put it simply, the pot chances aren't huge enough to validate a call. We need to fold. Expect the pot was $280 after the bad guy pushed, and it still cost us $30 to call. In this case, the pot would be providing us chances of 280 to 30, or 9.33 to 1. Much bigger than the chances versus us making our hand, so we'd simply have to call. One method to make this kind of choice is to compare the pot chances we're being provided with the chances versus making our hand. We must call if the pot chances are larger than the chances versus making our hand. Otherwise, we need to fold. The other method of considering these choices is to consider our equity. Equity is simply an elegant word for the likelihood that we'll win the hand. In this case, we're presuming that simply 7 cards out of 46 hidden cards offer us the winning hand. Our equity is 7 out of 46, or approximately 15%. The chances on a deal, in the initial case where the pot was $80 and we might require 30, were 8 to 3, which indicates we require to be excellent 3 out of 11 of the times, or around 27%. Once again, we ought to fold because our opportunity of winning, our equity, is much smaller sized than it requires to be for calling to be rewarding. For the sake of efficiency, note that when the pot is using us chances of 280 to 30, we require to be great, simply 30 out of 310 times, or around 10%, which is much less than our equity of 15%, so we simply have to call. The following table demonstrates how the likelihood of making our hand on the river, with the variety of outs, we need to make the very best hand. 46 unseen cards on the turn. Number of outs, 1. Chances of hitting on the river, 2.17%. Number of outs, 2. Chances of hitting on the river, 4.35%. Number of outs, 3. Chances of hitting on the river, 6.52%. Number of outs, 4. Chances of hitting on the river, 8.7%. Number of outs, 5. Chances of hitting on the river, 10.87%. Number of outs, 6. Chances of hitting on the river, 13.04%. Number of outs, 7. Chances of hitting on the river, 15.87%. 0.22%. Number of outs, 8. Chances of hitting on the river, 17.39%. Number of outs, 9. Chances of hitting on the river, 19.57%. Number of outs, 10. Chances of hitting on the river, 21.74%. Number of outs, 11. Chances of hitting on the river, 23.91%. Number of outs, 12. Chances of hitting on the river, 26.09%. This triggers the guideline of 2, which states that with one card to come, we can approximate our percentage of equity by merely increasing our variety of outs by 2. To put it simply, the numbers because of last column and close enough to those computed in the center column. What if bad guy pushed all in on the flop instead of the turn? It's more complicated this time since there are 2 cards to come, not 1. To exercise the possibility that we may make our hand, it's most likely simpler to exercise the likelihood that we do not make our hand, and deduct that from 1. There are now 47 hidden cards. Expect our company believes that we have 7 outs. I have not provided an example here, however it's trivial. Let's simply state that we have actually provided ourselves 7 outs for the sake of argument. The possibility that we do not strike on the turn is 40 out of 47. If we do not strike on the turn, then there are 46 hidden cards, 7 of which would be excellent cards for us on the river. The possibility that we do not strike on the river would be 39 out of 46. The possibility that we miss on the turn and after that miss out on once again on the river is then the item of these 2 likelihoods, 40 out of 47 multiplied by 39 out of 46. The possibility that we do strike on either the river or the turn equals 1 minus the possibility that we do not strike on the turn or river equals 1 minus 40 out of 47 multiplied by 39 out of 46, which is approximately 0.28 or 28%. The following table demonstrates how the likelihood of striking on the river or the turn modifications with the variety of outs we need to make the very best hand. Number of outs, 1. Hitting on the turn or river, 4%. Number of outs, 2. Hitting on the turn or river, 8%. Number of outs, 3. Hitting on the turn or river, 12%. Number of outs, 4. Hitting on the turn or river, 16%. Number of outs, 5. Hitting on the turn or river, 20%. Number of outs, 6. Hitting on the turn or river, 24%. Number of outs, 7. Hitting on the turn or river, 28%. Number of outs, 8. Hitting on the turn or river, 31%. Number of outs, 9. Hitting on the turn or river, 35%. Number of outs, 10. Hitting on the turn or river, 38%. Number of outs, 11. Hitting on the turn or river, 42%. Number of outs, 12. Hitting on the turn or river, 45%. This generates the guideline of 4, which states that with 2 cards to come, we can approximate our percentage equity by merely increasing our variety of outs by 4. We're presuming that bad guy isn't bluffing. In other words, we're constantly working with price quotes. If we can make much better quotes than our challengers and or utilize the outcomes of our considerations much better than they do, we'll make money in the long run. We now have our guideline of 2 and 4, which informs us how to approximate our equity when we require to enhance with 1 or 2 cards to come. In all of the above, we presumed that the bad guy was all in, so there was no additional wagering. In other words, what if there's a really genuine opportunity that if we call, there could be more wagering on later streets? Think about pot chances and how they compare to your opportunity of striking your hand, discovered by increasing your outs by 2 on the next street. If you can call beneficially, you must do so. If you get in touch with the flop, due to the fact that it paid to do so, however miss out on, and now deal with another bet on the turn, you can then reassess and approximate your possibility of striking on the river, once again by increasing your variety of outs by 2. Simply put, take it one street at a time. Dealing with a bet on the flop with, state 8 outs and believing, I'm going to make my hand 8 times 4 equals 32% of the time, so I can call. It might be a huge error because that would be presuming that you see the next 2 cards for the cost of that single gets in touch with the flop. And with more wagering to come after you miss on the turn, that isn't real. To sum up, if bad guy is all in on the flop, there are 2 cards to come. So you increase your outs by 4 to get an excellent quote on your equity. If he's all in on the turn, you increase your outs by 2 to get an excellent quote of your equity. Understand how to use expected value, EV, both on and off the table to analyze your plays. Anticipated worth, EV, is the typical return on each dollar invested into a pot. If a gamer can anticipate, provided the likelihood to make more cash than she or he bets, the action is stated to have a favorable expectation, plus EV. On the other hand, if a call or a bet will, according to possibility, most likely lead to less cash being returned, the action is stated to be unfavorable, minus EV. The individual ought to just draw to that flush if to do so would be positive EV. In order to determine the EV, it is needed to compare the size of the bet with the size of the pot. A tumbled flush draw will come in roughly 1 in 3 times by the river. Therefore, in order for a call to be positive EV, the last pot should be bigger than 3 times the call. Say you're playing 5 to 10 limit poker on the button. There are 3 limpers to you, and you call with ace and 4 of diamonds. Both blinds call, so there is $30 in the pot. Well, there is now $55 in the pot, and it will cost you $5 to call. So the pot is offering you 11 to 1 chances. You need to pay $5 to win $55. If you raise and the other 5 individuals in the pot choose to call your raise, then you will be including $5 to the pot, whilst they will be jointly including $25. Notification that even though you have just a 33% possibility to win the pot, the appropriate thing to do is in fact to wager, in spite of understanding that you will most likely not win that specific single hand. You will win about 1 in 3 such hands in the long run, minus a couple of % of the time when somebody beats your flush with a full house, quads, or straight flush. Notification that all has actually been done so far is compare the present pot with the bet size required to call to compute EV. If the pot is $30 and you are faced with a $10 wager, the pot is not offering you the appropriate chances to call. It would require to be $120 overall, plus your $10 call. If you anticipate your challenger to call a $100 bet if you make your hand, then the pot is actually using 13 to 1 chances, the $30 pot at the time, plus the $100 included on later streets. For that reason, in this circumstance, the positive EV play would be to call. The benefit chances are 50 to 5. $50 won for a $5 bet, which can be minimized to 10 to 1. and 10 to 1 is 2 times as big as 5 to 1. The reward chances are called pot chances in a poker game. Comparing the chances of winning to the pot chances is how you can approximate your anticipated worth. Preferably, you wish to prevent all circumstances where you have an unfavorable expectation. Even little unfavorable scenarios can accumulate and bleed away your bankroll. Gambling establishments worldwide make countless dollars lost by gamers. Determining anticipated worth. You cannot constantly get an excellent concept of the possibilities of winning your hand and compute the pot chances, at least not without understanding what your challengers have, and they're not going to inform you. You will typically have a draw which, if you strike, you will be extremely likely to win the pot. In Texas Hold'em and Omaha, as soon as you see the flop, the percent opportunity of making your hand within one card is normally your number of outs, cards that will make your hand, increased by 2. And the chances of making your hand within 2 cards is your number of outs increased by 4. To make this simple, you wish to turn this percent possibility into chances, like 5 to 1. There are simple and adequate to remember. 50% equals 1 to 1. 33% 2 to 1. 25% 3 to 1. 20% 4 to 1. 16% 5 to 1. 14% 6 to 1. 12% 7 to 1. 11% 8 to 1. 10% 9 to 1. 9% 10 to 1. 8% 11 to 1. 7% 13 to 1. 5% 20 to 1. 4% 25 to 1. The odds of bold are the most critical to remember. Certain possibilities can be measured quickly. Take the X now in the X to 1 and increase the size of the bet. For example, when you have a 4 to 1 chance and your next bet costs $5, subtract 5 to 4. You want to have at least $20 in the pot. Your bets are not in the pool yet. Probably a little more, if you are not sure if you win before you hit the draw. You might even want to boost if your table is really loose and there are a lot of players in your hand, and they will probably stay in it. The pot is really big. Nonetheless, it is usually the right step to call or pass. Remember that the exact predicted value was not determined. For most citizens, this is neither necessary nor realistic. If it's bad, you get out, and you're calling if it's positive. You raise when you're a favorite to win the pot. Nevertheless, the worth is typically just barely positive, as has been shown. For example, the size of the pot is $1 more than your hand, and that dollar is tiny in comparison to the pot size. In view of this situation, you may want to lay your hand at times. You may lose a little money, but you do not take big swings at your bankroll. However, if you don't have to play, go for it all the way. Understanding bluffing and hero call. This is how we've built a scenario of pure bluff. There's a $1 pot. 2 teams live. Player 1 is flipping around a coin. Player 1 stares at the mouth of the coin. Player 2 doesn't see the coin. Player 1 has the balls, the right hand. If it has tails, then player 1 has a hand as much as it can, losing to any player 2. Player 1 is given the $1 or check option. Player 2 will call or fold the $1 bet if player 1 bets. Player 1 wins the pot without showing the coin if it folds player 2. The coins are exposed, and the best hand wins the pot as player 2 is named. Heads, player 1. Tails, player 2. The coin would show the best hand taking the pot if player 1 checks. This maps quite well into a setup of poker bluffs on the water. Either you have the nuts 50% of the time, or you have the remaining 50% bad. This only applies to whether player 1 is bluffing and whether player 2 is bidding. When you check, lift if you are betting, and if the bluff number is set, player 2 has no choice for betting. How is player 1 supposed to play? Player 1 should always invest in interest if it has nuts. Why is this possible? Player 1 wins a $1 pot, same as player 1's first check, while player 2 folds. Betting is always as good or better than checking. Player 1 is awarded. If player 2 calls, the pot plus the bet is more effective than the first check. Betting always has an estimated checking value. It becomes more important if player 2 does not have the hand. If a coin appears, say player 1 bluffs. If player 2 calls, player 1 loses a $1 bet. EV -1. Player 1 wins a $1 bet while player 2 folds. EV +1. Suppose player 1 will check if a coin comes up. Player 2 will check and player 2 will win the pot. When player 1 has nothing, no strategy wins. Only one outcome, since we don't let player 2 bet. There is no consistent outcome if every player practices a single strategy. It's best for player 2 to be loose if player 1 is aggressive. Player 1 collects all bluffs for $2 and loses all bet value for $1 only. If player 2 is active, player 1 should be passive. The interest of the betting is $1, and the bluffing is not caught. In each cell, one player moves against the next cell, chasing each other around the matrix. There is no mere Nash equilibrium technique in the lingo. Now assume every player has a mixed strategy to choose. Player 1 chooses violent bluff, an arbitrary percentage of the time. Player 2 picks a loose call, an arbitrary percent of the time. Player 1 is now indifferent to wagering or checking when player 2 calls 50% of the time. Randomly calling 50% of the time is an untapped player 2 tactic. Player 1 will now bet 50% of the time it doesn't have a hand and will give up the pot 50% of that time. Player 2, with 2 interest bets for each bluff, is faced with this tactic. 50% of player 1's hands has nuts and bets. 25% of player 1 hands has no pause. Player 1 has no hand and folds, giving up the pot. 25% of the hands. If player 2 calls, player 2 wins 1/3 of the time, $2. $1 pot plus $1. Player 1, 3 wins for $1. The EV is 0, just like folding. Calling or folding is insensitive to player 2. Random bluffing of 1/3 of the bets, 50% of the time the coin is tails, is a tactic that player 1 cannot take advantage of. When player 1 only bets on heads and bluffs 50% of the time on tails, while player 2 calls 50% of the time, this is the Nash balance of mixed strategy. No player can increase the combination of strategies. Player 2 also breaks with calls. Player 1 also breaks on bluffs, but wins $1.50 per bet. $1 plus 150% plus additional when the bet has been called. Player 2 breaks even with calls. Player 1 receives 75 cents from player 2 overall, EV versus 0.25. Player 1 gets 50% more EV per hand compared with only betting for interest while bluffing. As an example, consider what happens when one of them changes tactics to the EV of each player. This is also the representation of the question and the equilibrium of Nash. Now let's solve it more generally and learn more about what the solution in the LS for various bet sizes looks like. Suppose we have established the problem in general. P, the initial pot, equals 1. S, the size of a bet as a pot fraction. P bluff, the bluff risk. P call, the call chance. Q, how often will player 1 bluff? A, adequate often to rip or fold player 2, oblivious. EV call, 1 plus S is a bluff, is calling player 2. Minus S when a value bet is called by player 2. EV fold, 0. Player 2 setting, EV call, equals EV fold. P bluff, 1 plus S, minus 1 minus P bluff, S equals 0. P bluff solving. There is a better way to say that. Specify the bluff's value bet ratio as then. In our example, S equals 1, as bet equals pot size. Our game theory optimal bluffing ratio is 1 out of 2. We should bluff half as often as we should value bet. Q. How often should the player 2 call? A. Often enough to make player 1 indifferent to checking or bluffing. EV bluff. P equals 1 when player 2 folds. Minus S when player 2 calls a bluff bet of S. EV check, 0. EV bluff equals 1 minus P call minus P call S. EV check, 0. Setting player 1's EV bluff equals EV check. 1 minus P call minus P call, S equals 0. Solving for P call. Bluff ratio, chance call, and EV depending on the size of the pot. Interpretation. If the bet size, S, is too close to 0 as part of the pool, player 2 should always make a small bet to make sure player 1 is fair. As S to 0, the number of calls is 100%. Player 1's best answer is never to gamble and break the pot. As the bet size grows, calling for a big bet for a small pot to holding player 1 fair is riskier for player 2. It leads to a higher bluff average as S increases, and a larger fraction of the pot gets from player 1. As S is omnipresent, player 1's EV omnipresent and player's 2 EV omnipresent. If we make a 3D EV plot with S equals 1 for each character, we get this. Here, you can experience a multifaceted interactive version by tapping and dragging. It is an attached saddle in 2 corners above and 2 corners below at EV equals 0.5. The 4 angles are flat aggressive, passive, tight, loose tactics, 100%. The 2 axes along each player can adjust his strategy for the Nash balance bluff plus 0.5 and call percent equals 0.5 form the horizontal plane. Neither can change the strategy unilaterally. But if one player is moving away from the Nash balance on the axis representing the other player's strategy, it is vulnerable to the other's exploitation. Movement along the strategic axis can improve the EV of the other player. What's hero call? Where to use and where to not. If your side is painful, but you still make a bold decision, then you are considered the hero. This call is made on the river by Omaha and by Hold'em Poker. One player places a significant bet or raise that is the nuts, and the hero then calls the bet or raise and finally gets the pot. Many players lift with their balls, some threatening. The hero is a poker strategy to bluff when it realizes that an adversary is trying to shut off a bluff. Obviously, the risk factor comes because the star has a weak side. But the bravery of the hero will bring a large number of chips when this is achieved at the right time. The danger can, however, lead to a major loss. Here are some tips to help you understand if your plan is correct. See the value of the bet. If you're playing poker for fun, you probably didn't notice this, but the pot odds are one of the subjects most widely discussed by players. The chances to win will always be one of the main factors when you have a chance to invest. If the bet is less, you can use a wider range than your opponent makes a large bet if your bet is less. If you only have to take around 20% of the time for the hero, if your competitor is using small wagers on the flop and turn. You need to win over 36% to gain a profit if your competitor makes a huge bet on the river. Your hero call will be more at risk as a result of the increased odds. Blockers versus hand strength. It does not actually matter how strong your total hand is if your hand does not beat any hand inside the value range of your challenger. Instead, what matters is what your hand brings to card removal. A hand that can catch bluff limits the variety within your opponent can wager while also unblocking his bluff possibilities. Think about backup equity on the flop and the turn. There are times when you discover yourself at the top of your challenger's variety, even when your hand is ideal for bluff catching. Backup equity refers to the chance to enhance your hand to the finest offered outcome if you find yourself behind. Understanding the hero call is a crucial part of finding out the game of poker. As you increase in your sophistication within the game, then you will comprehend when such big dangers make sense, and when they are less likely to pay off for you. It is always a threat, however. Mitigating threats helps you approach making profits. The easiest way to remember poker hand ranks. The least likely hands are the highest ranked. The most typical hands are the lowest ranked. Identical poker hands are ranked by which hands hold cards of the highest worth. Poker hand rank. Here's the standard hand rank, from the highest to least expensive. 1. Royal Flush. 5 cards ranking 10 to ace of the exact same fit. The only unsurpassable hand. 2. Straight Flush. 5 cards of the exact same fit in successive order. 3. 4 of a kind. A hand containing 4 identically ranked cards. 4. Full House. A hand containing a set and a 3 of a kind. 5. Flush. A hand containing 5 cards of the very same suit. 6. Straight. A hand containing 5 cards unsuited in successive order. 7. 3 of a kind. A hand including 3 identically ranked cards. 8. 2 pair. A hand consisting of 2 matched set of cards. 9. Pair. A hand including a matching pair of cards. Playing a live game of poker requires that you know this hierarchy. For new gamers, this may appear a little challenging. After all, here you have 9 pieces of intricate info to bear in mind in precise order. A word about mnemonic devices. I discovered the order of poker hands using a mnemonic. I think anybody can utilize this easy approach to find out the hierarchy in a matter of minutes. Mnemonics are popular memory gadgets utilized by students, instructors, and individuals of all stripes for hundreds of years in order to keep in mind complicated info. You probably use a mnemonic gadget to bear in mind the order of the world in our planetary system. I remember discovering the sentence, "My very excellent mom just served us 9 pizzas. The very letter of each of the words in that sentence will assist you in keeping in mind the planets of this order: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. I'll probably never forget that fact, thanks to the mnemonic device I was taught. The difficulty is, it's difficult to convert hand rankings into words. Besides that, I do not think you find out much about poker by just memorizing the order of the hands. You ought to use the chance of needing to learn proper hand hierarchy to improve your understanding of the poker method. The ideas below will assist you in understanding the proper order of poker hands better and introduce you to some basic poker principles to assist you in improving your general game. Low-value poker hands. To keep in mind the order of the 4 lowest value hands, simply keep in mind the number series 0, 1, 2, 3. 0 suggests high card. Having absolutely nothing in your hand indicates the value of your hand depends upon the worth of your greatest card. Keep in mind, in poker, aces rank high, while 2s rank low. 1 suggests 1 pair. Any hand that includes simply a single set of cards and absolutely nothing else valuable is a 1. 2 indicates 2 pair. This is a hand that contains 2 sets of cards. 3 indicates 3 of a kind. It's the most valuable of the low value hands. High value poker hands. For the purpose of this post, I'm calling every hand above a 3 of a kind a high value hand. But great deals of poker strategists would think about a straight to be a low value hand. This is really a difference in philosophy and a language problem more than anything else. Because of that, and for simplicity's sake, I like to think about the straight as the backslash symbol in my mnemonic. That means our existing mnemonic string goes 0, 1, 2, 3, backslash. It's simpler to remember the order of the other high-ranking hands if you count the number of the letters in the hand's name. It's made all the easier to keep in mind by the truth that the number of the letters increases as you move up the scale. Here's how I break it down. 5. The word flush includes 5 letters. 9. The words complete house contain 9 letters. 11. The words 4 of a kind consists of 11 letters. 13. The words directly flush include 13 letters. 18. The words royal straight flush contain 18 letters. Putting them entirely, our mnemonic is 0, 1, 2, 3, backslash, 5, 9, 11, 13, 18. Other ways to memorize hand hierarchy. I'm not going to pretend that the approach I use to learn hand hierarchy is the just one that will work. You can utilize any of the 4 techniques explained on this post to keep track of what hand beats what other hands. Route memorization. Some people find out best by repeated drilling of the product to be memorized. I've become aware of actors reading their scripts over and over, playing tapes of the script in their sleep, and discovering their lines by rote. I can't believe of any factor why you should attempt this technique. Hand evaluation diagrams. Various poker trainer programs and method experts have assembled diagrams to assist you in evaluating your hand. You can utilize these in poker rooms, and clearly you can use them online, so long as you do not care about the other people at the table making fun of you. They're offered free of charge with an easy Google search. Frequent exposure. The more rounds of poker you play, the more you'll end up being familiar with all the rules, consisting of the guidelines of hand ranking. You might lose a bunch en route there, due to the fact that your absence of familiarity with hand ranks, but you'll get it ultimately. Keep in mind that some poker variations appoint various values to hands and cards. Some games are totally reversed, rewarding the lowest value hand rather than the highest value one. Other games may consider an ace to be low, or use jokers, which tosses off the hierarchy and method a bit. Hand reading. Putting players on a hand. For those who aren't great at it, the capability to put a poker player on a hand is a difficult concept to comprehend. And when viewing it done correctly, it appears practically magic-like and mystical. Misunderstandings abound about the notion of determining what an opponent is holding, and lots of gamers even think that the objective of putting a poker player on a hand is to deduce the exact 2 cards in his hand. Nothing might be even more from the truth. Although it's uber cool to be able to reveal your challenger's 2 whole cards to him, and very perplexing for any opponent to be seen as that transparent, it neither happens extremely typically, nor is it very crucial in the general scheme of playing winning poker. While you'll sometimes encounter an extremely uncreative opponent who plays as though his cards were face up, and every now and then you'll take a deductive stab at a challenger's hand that hits the nail squarely on the head, simply delight in the minute, since it does not happen very often. The key is putting a gamer on a hand is to understand your opponent, and that suggests getting a repair on his playing tendencies. You won't be able to make a precise evaluation of his playing variety in given circumstances if you don't know your challenger's playing propensities. If you can't understand his style and playing propensities, his hand will usually remain a secret, and you will not have much of a concept of how well your hand plays versus his variety. If you're playing poker properly, you'll be getting used to your challenger's style of play, and as a result, it's more vital for you to arm yourself with the understanding, ability than to have a particular playing style of your own. If you can master this ability set, you'll discover times when you can win with absolutely nothing in your own hand, and other celebrations when you can make the toughest of laydowns, saving money while doing so, due to the fact that you're sure of your read and ready to release hands that may be the death of other gamers. Your design may be tight in some situations, while it's aggressive and loose versus different challengers. This ability to understand your opponent's weaknesses and how to control your own play to take benefit of those flaws makes you challenging to safeguard versus while putting your challenger in a position of having to make adjustments to his own game in order to play poker versus you. You may discover that your challenger is out of his comfort zone and simpler to exploit as a repercussion when that occurs. The first law of hand reading. You can start the procedure of putting a gamer on a hand by making this presumption and holding to it unless proven otherwise by a gamer under study. We'll call it the very first law of hand reading. The earlier a gamer's position in the wagering order, the narrower the series of hands he is probably holding. When an early position player calls a bet prior to the flop, he probably has a huge pair, a couple of overcards, or has a little pair and is wishing to flop a set, or get out if he does not. In later on positions, players are most likely to delve into the fray with a wider range of whole cards. That makes putting them on a hand harder. It's not impossible, and it can be done. When push comes to shove, you truly don't have that many choices at the poker table, and each of them can supply info about your opponent's hand. If nobody has wagered, you examine it. You can bet. If there's a bet prior to your turns to act, you can fold, you can raise, you can call. Presuming your opponent's bet, it's a standard size bet, one he'd make with definitely nothing or a pocket set of aces. You can start to put him on a hand. Despite the fact that you will not be able to figure out the precise two cards he's holding, some sort of hypothesis is far better than guessing. House on the range. This hypothesis, this initial numeration about what your opponent may be holding, is called a variety. A range represents all the hands a gamer may have when he took that particular action. Let's say he raises the blind from middle position, and based upon what you've seen up until now, you figure he'd make that have fun with any sets of fives or much better, an ace-9 offsuit or better, an ace-8 suited or better, and king-queen. You can use a shortcut for explaining this range by composing 5 to 5 plus, ace to 9 offsuit plus, ace to 8 suited plus, king-queen. In the most basic terms, you'll wish to fold your bad hands, re-raise with your excellent ones, and most likely call with the type of hands that offer huge implied chances as long as you have good reason to believe you can take his whole stack if you make a big hand. To do this, naturally, both of you and your opponent must have sufficiently sized stacks to make this sort of play beneficial. If either of you is shortly stacked, the efficient stack size, the amount of money you can possibly play for on this hand, is the smaller size of the stacks. The message here is simple. Don't play long shot drawing hands when you can't perhaps win enough to cover more than the long shots versus completing your draw. This is an oversimplified view of things, to be sure, since even though you have a hand that is not towards the leading portion of your opponent's likely variety of holdings, you might continue playing if you have factor to believe that a bluff on this or a prospering round might win the pot. Even if you have an average hand, one that will suspect will win the pot, heads up against this specific challenger just about 40% of the time if things went to a showdown, but you think a bluff would succeed 20% of the time. The combination of effective possibilities provides you a playable hand. Walk a mile in his shoes. That very first law of hand reading, the earlier a player's position in the betting order, the narrower the series of hands he is probably holding, is really a diplomatic immunity of putting yourself in your challenger's shoes. Believe about the hands he would need to have in order to raise in that area if he raised from middle position. When you do this, be cautious of simply presuming your opponent would make that with the exact same hands you would need you have remained in his position. He might have a range comparable to yours, but then again, it may be very different. He might be a much tighter player, or he could be loose and aggressive, or he could differ his variety depending on how he reads your playing style. That's one of poker's intricacies. He's reading your hand while you're reading his. And while you may be making a play contrary to one suggested entirely by the strength of the cards in your hand, he may be doing the extremely same thing. However, with every action your opponent takes, you should have the ability to narrow down his variety of hands from your starting point to another, more precise point, where you can be more precise about how you need to play your hand in relation to the range of hands you believe he is holding. If you believe this process can get needlessly made complex, with wheels within wheels, dizzily spinning, simply disavow yourself of that presumption today. While you may face some very sophisticated gamers at the poker table, you won't run into them really typically, unless you routinely play against the world's finest. For most scenarios you face, the most basic explanation is probably to be the right one. While there's a great deal of complexity in poker, and deception is the guideline rather than the exception, don't make it too complicated, or the only one you're likely to fake out will be yourself. Where to look for your opponent's weakness. Pay specific attention to how he plays the leading set with the leading kicker when you're very first beginning to analyze a gamer's design. It's a very typical hold'em hand, one that a far lot of your opponents are going to play a bit more recklessly than they really should. If you're lucky, you'll discover opponents who are constantly ready to go all in with leading pair top kicker as long as the board is not otherwise threatening. When you run into a player like this, make note of it. You will not require two numerous hands like this to turn almost any session into a winner. You also need to be very cognizant about how your opponent plays flush or straight draws. Does his design depend on how lots of opponents he's challenging? Or whether he has extra outs, such as overcards, to go along with his draw? And some predicate their play on their assessment of their challengers. Along with any other outs they might have, the number of challengers in hand with them, and how that affects their suggested chances if they are fortunate sufficient to complete their hand. The subsequent and second laws of hand reading. You can begin by making some assumptions about him or her if you know nothing about your opponent. But do not keep these assumptions as soon as you begin to gather more information due to the fact that the straw guy you are constructing is not likely to be exactly like the reality of the person throughout the table from you. Your opponent knows a minimum of a little something about the position and its value at the poker table. Most of your opponents are not brain dead. They comprehend that each bet made is developed to achieve something. If they overbet the pot, they have a factor for it. A common reason for overbetting is to price extracts of the pot. If they underbet, they have a reason for that too. Numerous players underbet to entice in callers or make a smaller wager, called a blocking bet, that they anticipate their opponent to call, because it seems a better alternative than having and expecting to call a larger bet from your opponent. An obstructing bet is generally made. An opponent who calls the raise in a late position generally has a speculative or drawing hand of some sort. When he re-raises, he typically has a huge beginning hand and desires to protect it. Worry and no fear. These are opposite sides of the same coin. Some gamers constantly suspect beasts under the bed and will appoint varieties to other players' hands that make it almost difficult for them to call or raise, unless they hold the very best possible hand at the time. That's not putting a gamer on a hand. It's taking yourself off a hand, your hand. To be accurate, and if you do it too typically, you'll discover yourself without a bankroll to play with. There are just some hands you're bound to lose money with, and perhaps go broke with entirely. That's okay. In some cases, you can't avoid losing your buy-in. But the stone-cold nuts don't occur all that frequently. You can't presume that beasts are constantly under the bed. In truth, the majority of the time, they're not there at all. Other poker players seem to always put their challenger on a variety of hands that they can beat most of the time, therefore giving themselves permission to play a wider variety of hands that they truly ought not to. Do not put your opponent on a hand by assuming he has a variety of hands you can beat. You need to temper what you want to occur with the truth of what your enemy probably has, not what you hope he's holding. More than a couple of otherwise good players are long-lasting cash losers since they approach scenarios out of worry, while others lose out of impractical assumptions asserted on how weak they wish their challenger's hand was. Putting gamers on hands is not the application of any one specific ability. It's a formative process, to be sure, and the more you practice putting gamers on hand varies, the more accurate you'll end up being. And because any accurate read can conserve you an entire buy-in, or win you one, a huge quantity of worth accrues from learning and practicing this capability. Limping. The good, the bad, and the ugly limping, as a poker method goes, is typically considered a quite weak one. It takes place when you call the minimum bet so that you can remain in the hand. And in neighborhood poker, see more cards. As the Kenny Rogers song The Gambler teaches us, you've learnt more about when to hold 'em, know when to fold 'em. Hoping, most of the time, is an indication that a player truly doesn't know when to fold a hand. It indicates to the other gamers at the table that your hand is weak and you simply want the chance to see additional cards. While there are absolutely times when it's useful as a part of a poker strategy, the huge majority of the time that you hear poker analysts stating that someone was limping into a hand, it means that the player didn't have anything beneficial, however played through anyhow. Lots of poker coaches will inform you to prevent hopping at all expenses, and definitely this method is a great one for new gamers, due to the fact that there are so numerous things that might fail. The bad. Reasons to prevent limping. Rookie players believe you can limp with anything. One of the most significant errors that beginning poker players make is not knowing when to fold. In essence, they limp into every hand, rather than being able to examine a hand for its playability and total worth. What kinds of hands you desire to utilize when you limp depends on your play design, that of the other players at the table, your position, and the reason that you're limping. You might underplay your hand. This is among the primary criticisms of limping as a method. Many coaches and gamers will inform you that if you have a strong, sufficient hand, you need to be raising. Even if you do not have a strong, adequate hand, you need to be raising. The general mentality amongst the dominant school of poker theory mentions that you ought to quite much constantly either fold or raise, as limping makes you appear weak. If you miss the chance to raise and get additional money out of your opponents, or you fail to raise and after that lose the hand since you didn't weed out the other gamers, then you aren't getting the maximum value that you could from each hand. Any serious poker gamer will tell you that optimizing your returns is the very first rule of poker. If you fail to do it, you're not playing. It's simple to get caught or pot committed. If you're limping in with a middle strength or weak hand simply to see the flop, you're investing cash that the hand may not be worth. When you've hopped into a hand, you might also believe that it's worth to call a little raise in case your flush or straight makes. However, doing so will get you more pot committed and then you're trapped. It sets you up as a weak gamer. Limping suggests weakness, and players who frequently limp are therefore seen as weak gamers. If you make a habit of limping into hands, other players are inclined to think that you either do not know when to fold or do not have a strong enough hand to raise. In either case, your opponents will feel great that they can take your cash without much of a fight. The excellent. When limping might be practical. Contrary to what novice poker guides will inform you, there are a few good reasons to limp into a hand. While limping does offer control of the hand to another player, this can be an invaluable tool in manipulating your opponents. You want to trap a challenger. There are a couple of ways to utilize limping to fool your opponent, but they both depend on using your knowledge of your challenger's frame of mind and play design. You can limp in with a strong hand and wait for your challenger to raise. Note that this works best when the other gamers at the table have actually folded. and from there you can either re-raise or call. Either one will amaze your challenger and throw them off their game. With a re-raise, you risk the chance of your challenger folding, which could indicate that you get less the optimum value out of your hand. You'll have to use your own judgment to figure out which tactic works best in the moment. There are several callers on the hand. If you've been playing at your present table for a while, and you notice that there are several players who call each time anyone raises, you might wish to consider limping instead of wagering. Considering that the whole point of raising before the flop is to terrify away other players so that you have less competition for the best hand. Several callers revoke the value of the raise because they're going to remain in anyhow. Because you're not removing the competitors on a hand, limping is usually the finest way to see extra cards without making a raise, especially when you don't have the cards in your hand to back it up. You're in late position. If you have a mid-strength hand, not really sufficient to wager on, however one that could do quite decently with the ideal flop, you may wish to limp in if you're in a late position, as it will allow you to see the flop on the cheap. You run the risk of among the blinds raising, but if you're pretty sure that nobody's going to call you, and in late position, you ought to have a good concept of the attitudes and design of the other gamers still in hand, then limping will offer you valuable info. Some strategists would encourage a button to raise so that you have a chance to steal the pot, but this depends on the playing method of the other players of the table. You can use a limp push to alter your image. Limp pushing, or limping with a strong hand, ace-ace to queen-queen, and then re-raising works best at aggressive tables where the play is quick and is most effective from early position. You want to use this tactic against players who believe and reason through their relocations, so it's finest to use it in tourneys at higher stakes tables. Your challengers view your limp as a sign of a weak point, so they raise to knock you out of the play. When you re-raise, they're forced to either fold or call with a hand that is weaker than yours. You can limp push with weaker hands if your stack is big enough. This is an excellent method to secure the blinds from gamers trying to steal them. Either method you do, a limp push asserts that you're a dominant, strong player and one that is not to be ignored. The unsightly. Limping in summary. While there are advantages to limping into a hand if you have a weak hand, the chances are that the flop isn't going to make it much better. If you have a strong hand, you may be losing on the opportunity to make additional money, and even your possibility to win the hand. Trapping opponents is difficult, and it's not a move for the faint of heart. If you're sure that you have the basics of poker strategy down, you can attempt using limping as a technique. Up until then, it may be best to prevent it. The best and worst Texas Hold'em poker starting hands. The strength of your starting hand in Texas Hold'em can help you identify your possibilities of winning, even before the remaining cards are dealt. From a pair of aces, the greatest starting hand, to a 2 and a 7. Knowing the strength of your beginning hand is an important part of your success at the table. When playing Texas Hold'em, you need to know which beginning hands are worth remaining in with, in which you need to fold. Finest starting hands. Having a strong beginning hand can help you identify your chances of winning, even prior to the flop that is dealt. In general, you're a strong contender if your beginning hand contains ace-ace, the strongest starting hand in the game, king-king, queen-queen, jack-jack. High pairs set you off well. An ace with a face card sets a good structure if the flop operates in your favor. Beyond these cards, you'll likewise frequently be delighted to see cards in sequence, especially the high cards and face cards in sets in your beginning hand. While some of these hands aren't constantly considered the ideal hands, they can in some cases pay off if you're willing to take a gamble. The specific sequence of cards and the order in which they rank is a crucial element of the game. Studying up on the finest starting hands in Texas Hold'em can help enhance your game and your chances of winning the pot. A strong starting hand might likewise motivate you to make a strong blind, your very first bet. Worst starting hands. When you're dealt with your starting hand, some combinations considerably lower your chances of winning. These are generally low number cards that are not in a series or suited. You may consider folding early if your two cards are a 2 or a 3, matched with a 7 or an 8. You can't make a straight or flush out of them. A face or an ace card with an inadequate low card. You're taking a threat relying on a single high card. 2 unmatched, unsuited low cards like 4 and 7, 5 and 8, etc. You'll rarely win with these. The method of what to hold and why takes a bit to master, so studying the worst starting hands in Texas Hold'em, much more, can assist you to enhance your game. Beginner's advice. Play only the cards in the 10 best list and always fold those in the worst hand list. Following this technique might improve your results. However, there is no assurance that receiving a strong beginning hand will take the round, or that a weak beginning hand is a definite loss. You never know how the flop might run, and while an unsuited 2 and 4 may appear like one to deal, often you'll be pleasantly surprised with a 2 pair, or even a full house. Study up on the numerous hands you're aiming for. How you approach the game will also differ based on the game itself. If you're playing No Limit Hold'em, knowing the leading No Limit Hold'em hands can help you better comprehend how to play them. As your ability boosts, you'll wish to learn how position impacts your Hold'em starting hand decision. The more you learn, the more you'll understand how crucial your beginning hands are to your bottom line. Play the great hands and fold the bad, and you'll be well on your method to becoming an expert at Hold'em. The importance of table position. If you desire to become an excellent, no-limit Texas Hold'em gamer, it is imperative you understand the importance of table position and the general techniques behind each position. Playing a lot of hands is the #1 error that new gamers make. If you already believe poker is pure luck, then stop reading right now. However, if you wish to take your game to the next level, you require to have a comprehensive understanding of table position. With this knowledge, you will naturally rely less on luck and receive less bad beats as an outcome. The position lets us see how other players at the table act. If I am in late position to act, I have an advantage over the other gamers since I can much better gauge the strength of their hand, in addition to my own. The position needs not to specify how to play your starting hands, however, it ought to offer you general guidelines. Play selectively and aggressively, and you will start to see your poker game and your profits grow. 9-player table position. I will define position based on 4 classifications: the blinds, early, late, and middle positions. The blinds. The little blind is the smaller size of 2 forced bet and is half of the huge blind. The huge blind is equal to the number minimum bet at the poker table. Normally, the blinds remain in the worst position due to the fact that they are pushed into betting without even taking a look at their cards. Nevertheless, they have the advantage of going last before the flop. After the flop, the blinds are in the worst position because they are the first to act. Keep this in mind before you call with a below average hand pre-flop. New players tend to call raises even if they currently have enough money in the pot. If you go after cards from the blinds, you stand to lose a lot of cash. Before you call, consider the raiser's table position and anything else you learn about him. Early position. Under the gun, or UTG, is the position instantly to the left of the big blind. This gamer is the very first to act after the cards are dealt. Position 5 and 6 on the chart are in some cases referred to as UTG plus 1 and UTG plus 2. Because you have no concept of how the gamers after you will act, the early position is the toughest to play from. All other scenarios aside, you must play premium hands from early positions. Aces, kings, queens, ace-king suited, and ace-queen unsuited should be played here and from any position on the table. You must likewise strongly think about playing jacks, tens, ace-queen suited, ace-jack suited, and king-queen suited. Middle position. Positions 7 and 8 are described as being in the middle position. Players in the middle position have the benefit of seeing how the gamers in early position act, but the disadvantage of not knowing what the players in late position will do. If there is a bet from a player in early position, fold everything but premium hands. Make a basic raise of 3 to 4 times the big blind if you have a great hand and are the very first to make a pre-raise flop. You wish to get the players in the blinds from calling with minimal hands and getting fortunate on the flop. If a good gamer in late position re-raises you, be prepared to fold anything but excellent beginning hands like ace-ace, ace-king, queen-queen, or king-king. If a good gamer from a later position just calls, be cautious of them having either an excellent beginning hand or a pocket set. Because you have a good starting hand, do not overcommit to the flop. Late position. Positions 9 and 1 on the chart are described as the cutoff and the button, respectively. And they have the very best position at the table due to the fact that they are the last to act. Late position is a huge benefit in No Limit Hold'em and ought to be treated. It can be a terrific relocation to choose up the blinds. The late position enables you to play a drawing hand if several players limp in before you. A drawing hand like Jack-10 suited has great pot odds. Hands that you would not wish to play in early position, such as a weak ace, ace-8, king-queen, or king-jack, become playable in late position. One of the worst things that you can do is check and let the gamers in the blinds see a complimentary flop if you have a good hand. The position is something to be benefited from. Even if your hole cards aren't really great, raising will frequently get players in the blinds in early position to fold hands they may have otherwise played in a different position. Keep in mind, nevertheless, whom you are raising, as this will impact the size of your raise and the quantity of aggression you require to put on him to win the pot. Blind stealing. What is a blind steal? A blind steal is an unopened raise from the button or the small blind. An unopened raise happens when all players acting prior to you fold pre-flop, and you put in a raise at the very first player to enter the pot. When the action folds to you in the small blind, or on the dealership button, your main objective is to remove the blinds uncontested with a BSA. Why is the blind stealing poker figure crucial? An effective poker player may have a win rate as low as 3 bets per 100 hands. This means that if they are dipping into stakes of 50 cents and $1, they anticipate making $3 for every 100 hands they play. Each effective blind steal nets you a profit of 1.5 BB. 2 successful blind steals over 100 hands is the distinction between recovering costs and playing rewarding poker. Blind stealing is especially crucial at the low stakes, where gamers do not always protect their blinds appropriately. This means they fold either frequently or not enough versus blind takes. You can track this using the poker stat folded to steal attempt, FB. Taking the blinds against weak, tight gamers with a high FB is the closest thing to printing cash in poker. You can open nearly any 2 cards beneficially if you are on the dealership button and are dealing with 2 gamers that have over 65% FB. Selecting a bet size for a blind take. When making a blind take, nevertheless, you can be a little bit more imaginative about your raise sizing due to the fact that you are thinking about the tendencies of just 1 or 2 players who can act after you. This does not suggest you should be sizing your raises bigger with premium hands, as all but the most oblivious of challengers will change to this strategy. Versus players who have a high FB, you can attempt using 2.25 BB or the minimum 2 BB raise sizes. Against players who have a low FB, you can try utilizing a 3 BB raise with a tighter variety of hands. These gamers will want to put more cash in pre-flop versus you with a range drawback. How to steal blinds effectively. Blind stealing can be the distinction between being a winner and a loser in poker. Find out whatever you need to understand below. Which opponents are the best to steal blinds versus? Certainly, nits are the very best challengers to take versus. They fold too much, so you'll give too much money taking against them. Gamers with high fold to steals are perfect. Of the people who protect their blinds, you want to make more versus people who flat than who 3-bet. Why? If people 3-bet a lot as a re-steal, you run the threat of understanding none of your equity with your worst hands. BB and SB, who are most likely to 3-bet a lot, are the worst. Strong, aggressive regulars, weak, aggressive fish, short stacks who are likely to push over your steals. For the same factor, your choice to steal in the cutoff should take into consideration how often your challenger in the BU flats. Bad because you're OOP, or 3-bets, even worse because you have to fold. Which hands should I use to steal blinds? Since your choices for stealing are raised or fold, you have no option to polarize. There's no call alternative for the middle of your range unless you limp your SB. However, that's another discussion entirely. You want to select the best 50% hands for taking. That indicates you desire hands that have the best feasible equity, a combination of how the strong hand is and how well it plays. General guidelines for hand choice in order of value. High cards to low cards. Suited cards to non-suited cards. Connected cards to non-connected cards. Blockers to non-blockers. How to react to a blind steal. The fact about the huge and small blinds is that you will lose money in the long term from these positions. It is unavoidable. If you are able to benefit from the huge and small blinds over a sample of more than 10,000 hands, you probably have such a skill edge over your challengers that it's time to think about going up in the stakes. You are attempting to lower your loss rate when you are defending your blinds. Let's look at the mathematics. You will lose 100 BB out of 100 hands from this position if you fold 100% of your hands from the huge blind. You will lose 50 BB out of 100 hands from this position if you fold 100% of your hands from the little blind. The whole objective of defending your huge blind is to minimize this loss rate. Losing in the little blind at around minus 20 BB out of 100 is thought about good, but it is possible to reach 15 BB out of 100. Losing from the huge blind at 35 BB out of 100 is obtainable. You are safeguarding the big blind against a take from the button. You will most typically have to protect your huge blind versus a raise from the dealership button. In these cases, the little blind will generally fold. You will have a post-flop positional drawback versus the button. You will have to act first, which offers your challenger details on how to play versus you. If you are against a proficient player, they will be opening 45% to 70% of their buttons against you. This implies that the variety of hands that they have is really wide, and you should defend a broad range of hands versus them. Against an extremely tight player, fold more typically. In addition to the looseness of the position, the expense to get in the pot is much lower for the big blind. While you'll be at a positional disadvantage post-flop, depending upon the raise size of your opponent, you will require really little equity to continue. Equity is simply the odds that you are going to win the pot based upon the strength of your hand pre-flop. To comprehend why you can call it so light, we can take a look at the math. If the button opens to 2 BB and the little blind folds, the pot is now 3.5 BB. If you call, you are investing 1 BB to win a pot of 4.5 BB. You just need a 22% chance of winning the pot to break even. You can call regularly versus smaller raisers and regularly fold against bigger ones. If your challenger is using a bet sizing of 2 BB, which is a minimum raise, you can safeguard, that is, flat call preflop or 3-bet preflop, approximately the leading 50% of the hands in the big blind. Versus a 2.5 BB raise size, you require to be tighter. You can safeguard roughly the top 30% of hands, protecting the huge blind against a take from the small blind. Defending the big blind versus the small blind is much simpler. You have a positional advantage, and the cost to play the pot will be lower due to the fact that you have already invested one huge blind. Against all, however, the tightest players, you can defend practically 100% of your range versus a minimum raise. Against larger raise sizes, you need to take a look at the frequency with which your opponent tries to take the blinds from the little blind. You can protect really light and play pots with a positional advantage against a wide variety of hands if they are opening over 40%. It is really basic to develop a method against those who do not take enough. You simply fold more. However, what you do versus aggressive players. Handling an over-aggressive blind thief to your right. You may be shocked at how aggressive you can be on the button. Good, winning gamers can put in steal attempts at frequencies of upwards of 60%. However, when a gamer starts to enter the world of 70% and above, you can consider them extremely aggressive. It can be frustrating to see them raising your blinds over and over. You know they frequently have nothing, and it is appealing to fight their aggression with aggression of your own. The very best technique against overly aggressive players is to just play strong, winning poker. When you start to develop post-flop poker data on overly aggressive blind stealers, you can call them light and make relocations versus them. Up until you have a technique for exploiting them, The easiest method to beat an overly aggressive playstyle is to simply continue playing tight, aggressive poker and win with your hand range advantage. The simplest adjustment to be made versus excessively aggressive players is to call a wider range versus them pre-flop. When safeguarding the huge blind, you are not trying to win every pot. You're going to lose regularly, then you win because of your positional drawback post-flop. Merely concentrate on the long-lasting plan of lowering your big blind loss rate. Safeguarding the little blind against the take. The small blind is a various beast from the big blind. It is much more difficult to safeguard. You then have the huge blind acting behind you if you flat call the original raiser. The huge blind can raise, putting pressure on you with a squeeze bet, or can flat call, getting an extremely great rate to see the flop. You are put into the difficult position of playing as the very first player to act post-flop if the big blind calls. The simplest method to handle defending the small blind is to use a fold or 3-bet method with nearly the totality of your range. 3-betting is an extremely effective tool for safeguarding both your huge and small blinds. Strategies for stealing momentum from other players by blocking their bets. How to make a blocking bet in poker. The what? A blocker bet describes wagering from out of position in order to manage how much money enters the pot on an offered wagering round. The why? When you're holding a minimal hand that can't withstand a huge bet, you can make a small bet that is likely to get called, however not raised, in order to get you or to see another card to face off for a less expensive rate. The when. Blocking bets are always made from out of position, considering that you should have the ability to act prior to your challenger. The who. Because making a small bet leaves you open to getting bluffed with a re-raise, this relocation is best matched to utilize versus tight, inexperienced challengers. The where. Blocking bets can be utilized effectively in both money games and competitions. Utilizing blocking bets properly. Not everyone settles on whether obstructing bets are generally efficient. However, they all inform you that you're doing it incorrectly. You're burning cash. We're here to inform you that at the right time, against the right opponent, a blocking bet can absolutely increase your earnings. The vital part of utilizing blocking bets is comprehending the line you're taking in hand and the kind of opponent you're up against. Weaker, tighter gamers are your targets when you're thinking of using an obstructing bet because a knowledgeable, difficult gamer will be able to exploit you by bluff raising. There are two primary circumstances where you ought to think about a blocking bet. Using blocking bet to see cheap river card. Imagine you're playing a hand of 1-2 no limit hold'em, and a gamer in middle position raises to $6. The small blind calls, and you decide to call with 9 of diamonds, 10 of diamonds. The flop comes ace of diamonds, jack of clubs, 5 of diamonds, and you check call a $12 continuation bet from the original raiser. The small blind folds, and the 2 of spades strikes the turn. If you understand enough about this opponent to understand he'll fire a second bullet with a vast array of hands, you can make a bet of your own and size it so that you're getting a much better price to draw to your flush. With $42 in the pot, you might bet $20, given that your opponent's most likely to make a more standard size bet of $30 to $35. And in addition to seeing the river for less if your challenger simply calls, you also choose up some fold equity for those times he completely missed out on the board and decides just to quit. Use blocking bet to see cheap showdown. The most typical and probably most efficient method to utilize the blocking bet is when you're reasonably positive you have the best hand on the river. However, you're not comfy calling a huge bet to get a face-off. Let's go back to the $1-2 cash game. Much like the very first example, a player raises, gets a call from the little blind, and you call with 9 of diamonds, 10 of diamonds in the big blind. This time, the flop comes down to 10 of hearts, 8 of clubs, 5 of spades. And you check call an extension bet from the original raiser after the small bet folds. You both examine the 5 of diamonds on the turn prior to the 2 of spades as it strikes the river. At this moment, you're reasonably positive that top pair is good. However, you'd rather not pay $35 to learn. By betting out for a smaller size quantity, you'll be able to see that showdown for a less expensive price, and you'll likewise get some fold equity. How to balance your blocker bet range. It's essential to understand that blocking bets are much more tough to utilize against good players. If you just bet little out of position with limited hands, seeking to get a cheap showdown, excellent players will just raise and blow you off your hand. To combat this, you need to stabilize your blocker bet range by doing precisely the exact same thing with your huge hands too. In the second example from above, you had pocket fives and tumbled a set. You examined the turn, hoping to slow play, and rather of examining again on the river to cause a bluff, your wager little to represent a blocking bet and a minimal hand. A good player will choose up on this and might attempt to bluff raise you off the pot, getting more money into the middle when you've got the finest of it. Strategies for playing from the button for maximum strength. If you're a skilled competition player, then you're most likely accustomed to the dynamics of attacking and protecting blinds. Late in a tournament, the huge blind normally represents a big portion of anyone's stack. If you can identify a gamer who folds his huge blind freely, then you've got a golden chance to collect chips with really little risk just by raising whenever that player remains in the big blind. On the other hand, you don't wish to get credibility as somebody who will not protect his blinds, since then everyone will be trying to take from you. Combating back vigorously versus efforts to take your blinds is called protecting your blinds, and it's something that hard players do to prevent to take attempts and deal with less competition for their blinds. When stacks are deep, a less comprehended, however equally essential idea is safeguarding your button. At this stage of a tournament, the blinds are fairly trivial, and earnings come primarily from playing in position, not from taking blinds. This will describe the value of protecting your button and provide some examples of how and why to do it. The importance of the button. Take a moment to look at your information by position if you play or used to play online, and usage tracking software such as Poker Tracker or Hold'em Manager. Your win rate should increase as your position improves, with an out of proportion quantity of your revenue originating from the button. This should be real regardless of stack sizes. The impact needs to be more remarkable if you filter your hands where everyone's stack is big relative to the blinds. In my case, after filtering for hands where there are no antes and my stack size at the start of the hand is greater than 50 times the big blind, my win rate in the cutoff is 32 BB out of 100 big blinds per 100 hands. Whereas on the button, it is 54 BB out of 100. Imagine just how much higher your win rate would be if you could play the button twice per orbit. This is basically what it takes if the player on your left folds often to your cutoff raises. You can benefit from this by raising more hands from the cutoff and realizing the advantages of the finest position on the table 2 times every orbit. For me, that would be the equivalent of increasing my win rate in the cutoff by 22 BB out of 100. Naturally, I'll only be in that position once out of every 9 hands. However, that still increases my general win rate by 2.5 BB out of 100, which is quite substantial. Poker is a zero-sum game, so those additional 22 BB out of 100 have to be originating from somewhere. Perhaps you thought it. That's mostly earnings that could come from the player on the button. He might do from the button whatever it is that I'm doing from the cutoff to win that additional 22 BB out of 100, if only he played his position more intensely. By effectively yielding his button to me when he doesn't have a premium hand, he is missing out on a great deal of possible profit. An aggressive gamer on your right who regularly raises the pot ahead of you requires to be dissuaded with frequent calls and re-raises. After a while, he will either stop trying to steal your button or routinely lose money attempting to play out of position versus you. 3-betting. Absolutely nothing is more reliable than aggressive 3-betting when it comes to hindering a regular raiser. Playing and calling in position can be rewarding as well. It isn't as nearly penalizing, considering that it allows your nettlesome opponent to see the flop with whatever junk he raised. By re-raising your button against a large opening variety, you force your opponent either to fold instantly and give away all of his equity in the pot, or put more money into the pot from out of position. It's crucial to understand that if your challenger chooses to call your re-raise, this is not a particularly bad result for you, even if you are bluffing. He is still confronted with the possibility of playing out of position versus you on 3 streets, and even if you don't really have a big hand, you can represent one, indicating that you need to have a lot of great bluffing opportunities. As a result, your 3-bet does not need to be so large that it forces your opponent to fold all but its greatest hands. Something like 2.5 times the original raise suffices to put pressure on an aggressive opener without risking too much of your own stack, or compromising your ability to maneuver and use your possession post-flop. Risking fewer chips will enable you to 3-bet regularly and with weaker hands, which is an excellent tool to have at your disposal. Due to the fact that you are offering your challengers enticing odds, you must 3-bet with hands like matched ports that have the perspective to make both strong hands and strong draws for semi-bluffing, if called. You can likewise re-raise hands that are well ahead of the opener's range, however simple to extract on, such as Ace-Jack offsuit and 2-2. Think about this as a thin worth bet. Of course, you'll make this exact same re-raise with legally strong hands such as Ace-King and Ace-Ace. You'll discover that aggressively re-raising your button will assist in getting you more action when you re-raise truly big hands, as long as you play them the same way you would your bluffs. Calling. Some hands are just unwanted for 3-betting. Re-raising typically causes your challenger to fold hands that you dominate and call with sets that dominate you, or with 2 overcards that are essentially a coin flip versus you. Worst of all, they open you up to a 4-bet from hands like Ace-Ace that simply may lose a big pot to you if you tumble a set. Broadway hands like King-Jack and Ace-10, particularly when fit, likewise tend to play much better in a single raised pot. They are too good to fold to a gamer with a large opening range, which probably consists of lots of hands you control, such as King-10, Queen-Jack, Jack-10, matched, etc. Unless the initial raiser is really loose, he will presumably fold the majority of the